there. Tonight, we are following a quiet piece of clay that may remember a decision older than history. In a museum room in Philadelphia, a small tablet, the color of pale sand, sits behind careful storage. And when scholars read its wedges beside the Sumerian king list and the old flood texts, a strange pattern appears. Earth is not described like a lucky accident. It is described like a place that was examined, organized, assigned, and prepared. If you enjoy this kind of slow historical mystery, like the video, subscribe, and come a little further in. Settle where you are. Let the day loosen its fingers, and listen closely, because tonight we are not chasing a conspiracy. We are sitting with real tablets, impossible rains, once-buried temples, and one unsettling question. Why did the oldest written civilization keep talking as though this world had been chosen? I have always found it a little eerie that some of the biggest ideas in history survive in the smallest objects. A bronze helmet can shout. A ruined ziggurat can still look proud. But a clay tablet the size of a book, resting quietly in a climate-controlled room, has to wait for patience. It does not advertise itself. It does not sparkle. It sits there with its pale, baked surface and those neat little wedge marks pressed into wet clay by a reed stylus thousands of years ago. And if you rush past it, it remains only a fragment. If you stay with it long enough, it begins to feel like a held breath. The source we are following begins exactly there, with a tablet from the Penn Museum, catalog number rendered in the modern system as CBS2673. Though in the script tonight, I want you to hear it simply as one more quiet object among tens of thousands. It arrived in America after excavations in southern Iraq, packed with many other tablets from the ancient city of Nippur, most of them ordinary in the most wonderful way. Lists of grain, temple accounts, student exercises, the paperwork of a civilization that knew how to count, store, assign, measure, and remember. And then among those records was this fragment, Old Babylonian in date, but likely copying a story already ancient when that copy was pressed into clay. That story is what scholars now call the Eridu Genesis. And honestly, I have always found that title gentler than the thing itself. It sounds tidy, almost familiar, but the text behind it is anything but casual. It describes the making of humanity, the first cities, and the Great Flood. More importantly for us tonight, it describes the first cities not as accidental achievements of wandering people who happened to settle in a good place, but as if they were bestowed, structured, lowered into the world with intent. That difference matters. It is the difference between a village growing and a system being installed. Imagine the tablet itself for a moment, not in a textbook, in the hand, or almost in the hand, under a scholar's light. The surface dry and faintly granular. The wedges still visible where the stylus bit into soft clay before the piece was baked by time and burial. Dust once lay over it. Earth once held it shut in silence. Whole empires rose and vanished while it slept in the dark. Then men with picks and brushes and notebooks lifted it back into air. It traveled by ship. It crossed oceans. It entered drawers and catalogs and scholarly editions. And still its strangest quality remained the same. It preserved a memory that sounded less like mythic invention and more like administrative recall. The source then places that tablet beside another object, the Sumerian king list, preserved most completely on the Weld-Blundell prism in Oxford. Four-sided, inscribed, rotating on a central axis. It carries one of the most famous and unsettling sentences in ancient literature. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. I have always thought that line lands with more force when spoken softly. Descended from heaven. Not discovered. Not negotiated. Not gradually improved by trial and error beside a muddy canal. Descended. The text treats governance itself as something transferred, and that is where the whole investigation begins to tighten. Because once you hear that sentence properly, it starts tugging at other sentences. If kingship descended from heaven, what exactly does that imply? If the first city receives governance as an institution from above, was Earth imagined as the birthplace of civilization, or as the site selected for civilization? The source is careful here, and I want to be careful too. It does not prove the answer. It invites the question. That matters. Good investigations do not force ancient texts to confess what they never said. They hold the lines up to the light and notice what kind of world those lines assume. The world assumed by these Sumerian texts is not a careless one. It is organized, assigned, measured, administered. Rivers are not merely there. They are managed. Cities are not merely crowded settlements. They are linked to deities, roles, places, and functions. Human beings do not simply appear because a god feels whimsical one afternoon. They are created in response to labor, burden, infrastructure, and the need to maintain the systems that make the world productive. Again and again, the source returns to this tone of administration, and I think that tone is the heart of the mystery. Myth usually loves the dramatic gesture. These texts often sound like records left by people who believed the world had gone through planning. If you were standing with me in that museum room, you might notice how strange it is that the oldest surviving literature can feel so procedural. Not cold exactly, because the Sumerians were never cold writers. Their texts breathe with gods and floods and laments and praise. But beneath that religious language, there is method. The first cities are assigned. The first kingship is transferred. Earth is described as surveyed, watered, organized, made fit. Even the flood later feels less like random tantrum and more like the reset of a system that had grown too noisy, too crowded, too disruptive for the terms under which it had been established. That administrative texture is what keeps the investigation alive. The source then pauses, very wisely, and reminds us that certainty is not available. I respect that. No honest scholar can walk into a room of ancient clay and come out claiming perfect knowledge of what happened before history. We are dealing with copies of copies, traditions preserved across centuries, translations improved and revised and argued over by experts who spend their lives bent over fragments. Some scholars read these texts as mythology in the fullest and most sufficient sense. Some treat them as philosophical reflections encoded in sacred language. A few push further, asking whether behind the literary forms there may be memories of things the writers could not fully explain, but were determined to preserve. The source does not collapse those possibilities into one dogmatic answer, and neither should we. Still, even uncertainty has a shape. The shape here is remarkably consistent. Earth is treated as a place with rare advantages. Water from above and below. Rivers that can be directed. Soil that can be worked. Seasons that can be read. A landscape harsh enough to demand organization and rich enough to reward it. The earliest cities appear in places that make hydrological sense. Eridu at the edge of ancient waters. Other seats of kingship distributed across strategic zones of the alluvial plain. The text does not say, in blunt, modern language, Earth was selected over Mars. That would be absurdly neat. Ancient literature is rarely so cooperative. But the source is right, that the cumulative effect of these tablets is stranger than neatness. They keep describing this world as if it possessed qualities recognized in advance and worth preserving. I have always found it beautiful that the Sumerians wrote from a land that was both severe and generous. Southern Mesopotamia could be brutal, marshy in places, flood-prone, hard in summer, lacking easy stone and timber. Yet out of this land came writing, cities, schools, law, hymns, astronomy, irrigation systems, and the first known great libraries of human memory. It is almost as though hardship forced observation into brilliance. When water matters that much, you do not speak of it casually. When rivers decide whether cities live or die, you learn to read land like scripture. And that is part of why the source feels convincing, even when it remains cautious. It is not asking us to believe one shocking line torn from context. It is asking us to listen to a civilization that spent thousands of years copying the same questions into clay. Why here? Why these rivers? Why this specific world of fresh water, fertile silt, and organized abundance? Why did kingship come down to Eridu? Why did the first cities arrive as assigned structures instead of accidental growth? Why do the oldest texts sound, again and again, like the records of a place that had been made ready? You know that feeling when one sentence changes the temperature of an entire archive? That is what happened to me the first time I really sat with that line about kingship descending from heaven. Suddenly, the king list was no longer only a curious, ancient document with impossible reigns. It was a doorway. A quiet, stubborn doorway. Once you step through it, the whole Sumerian corpus begins rearranging itself around one possibility. Earth, in these texts, is not merely home. It is project site. There is another reason that museum setting matters, and I do not want to rush past it. Those tablets survived because clay is humble. Papyrus burns. Wood rots. Cloth frays and forgets the hand that touched it. But clay, once fired and buried, can wait with almost offensive calm. I think that is one of the loveliest ironies in all of history. The first great human archive was not polished marble or shining metal. It was mud, shaped, dried, and trusted. A civilization that depended on rivers also trusted River Earth to remember for it. Picture a scholar reading one of those fragments late in the day. Notes open. Reference editions nearby. A lamp or desk light soft over the page. The tablet itself propped at just the right angle. One wedge after another, slowly resolving into values. Then words. Then clauses. It is never dramatic in the theatrical sense. No thunder. No hidden chamber opening. Just patience. And then, suddenly, a line speaks with unsettling clarity. Kingship descended. Cities were assigned. The world was prepared. That is how old evidence usually moves. Quietly, then all at once. I have always thought the real mystery in such work is not that ancient people wrote strange things. Ancient people wrote many strange things. The mystery is consistency. Different tablets, different periods, different scribal copies, different cities. Yet the same tone keeps returning. Earth is not spoken of as a random backdrop. It is spoken of as managed ground. That recurring tone is what gives the investigation its weight. One text can be dismissed as literary flourish. A whole tradition speaking the same way is harder to shrug off. Now, let the museum room come back around you for a second. The shelves, the careful boxes, the cool air that keeps old clay from cracking. Somewhere beyond the walls, traffic, modern light, a city of glass and cables and climate control, and inside one drawer, a fragment from a people who would have recognized none of that, but who understood with absolute intensity that the world under their feet was not ordinary. They pressed that conviction into clay. They copied it. They buried it by accident. We found it by persistence. And now, because of that long chain, we can ask the same question they left waiting for us. In the next movement, we need to step out of the museum and into the land itself, into the hot, flat plain between the Tigris and Euphrates. Because before we can judge whether Earth was described as chosen, we need to understand the people who said so, the difficult world they inherited, and the first city they believed stood at the beginning of everything. To understand why the Sumerians could write about Earth with such intensity, you first have to see where they were standing. That is the next turn in the source. And I think it is one of the most important, because ancient people are often flattened into abstractions. The first civilization, the inventors of writing, the builders of temples. All of that is true, but it can make them feel unreal, like a chapter title instead of a people with heat on their skin and river mud under their nails. The source slows us down by putting us back on the ground, and the ground in southern Mesopotamia was never simple. Imagine the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates 6,000 years ago. Flat, bright, exposed, and younger than many people realize in geological terms. This was not a mountain cradle with easy stone and cool forests. It was a land built by silt, by water dropping its burden over centuries until mud became ground firm enough for settlement and still loose enough to remind people that rivers can give and take with the same hand. Marshes breathed at the edges. Summer pressed down like a weight. Flooding could turn blessing into ruin almost overnight. There was little timber nearby for the grand ambitions of builders. Little stone waiting obediently in quarries close at hand. Metals had to be found, traded, brought from elsewhere. In some ways, it was a very inconvenient place to begin civilization. In another sense, that inconvenience is exactly what makes the Sumerian achievement feel almost supernatural in hindsight. The source describes this beautifully. What southern Mesopotamia had was water, rich silt, and the organizational genius to turn both into something the ancient world had never seen before. I have always loved that phrase, organizational genius. It sounds dry until you remember what it means. It means someone measured canals, someone tracked grain, someone assigned labor, someone stored seed, someone taught a child to copy a sign again and again until memory could live outside the body. Civilization is often romanticized through monuments, but most of it begins as accounting in a difficult landscape. The people who built this world called themselves the black-headed people. That phrase has always stayed with me because it feels intimate and local, the kind of name a people use for themselves before outsiders begin arranging them into categories. Modern scholars call them Sumerians, a name filtered through later traditions. But the source wisely lingers on their own terms, their own land names, their own sense of where the civilized world began. That matters, because if we are investigating a Sumerian claim about Earth being prepared, then we ought to stand as close as we can to the way they understood place. And place, for them, began with Eridu. I have always found Eridu quietly haunting. It does not roar the way later famous cities do. It does not glitter in popular imagination the way Babylon or Ur sometimes can. It sits earlier, lower, older. Like the first low note in a piece of music, people usually begin hearing too late. The source makes Eridu central, as it should, because the king list makes it the first city after kingship descends from heaven, and the archaeology, as far as archaeology can speak honestly in such matters, does not contradict that honor. Think of the excavations at Tel Abu Shahrain in the 1940s. Heat, dust, trenches cut into a mound that looked from a distance like one more rise in a landscape of rises. Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd working downward through levels of occupation. Broken brick. Temple debris. More debris. Then another structure beneath the one above it. Then another. 18 temple levels, each built upon the ruin of the previous one. I have always thought there is something deeply moving about that. A sacred place rebuilt so many times that the ground itself becomes a memory of worship layered upon worship. The earliest temple there was tiny, almost humble by later standards, barely wide enough to satisfy the expectations people bring to the word temple. But size is not the point. The point is intention. Offering table, ritual traces, community, repeat rebuilding. In a marsh-edged, difficult, water-dependent land, people kept choosing that place again and again. The source is right to let the archaeology breathe here, because whatever else one believes about the Sumerian texts, Eridu was not invented out of thin air by scribes with theological imaginations. It was real, old, persistent, a place where ritual and settlement were yoked together from very early on. Picture dawn at ancient Eridu. The air still tolerable before the full brutality of sun. Reed shadows leaning across damp ground. A low temple structure, not yet monumental, but already deliberate. Nearby water reflecting pale light. Mud bricks still holding the memory of hands. A few people moving in the quiet work of beginning a day. If you were standing there, you might not think, this is the birthplace of civilization. You might simply think, these people know exactly where the water matters most. And perhaps that is the more truthful version of civilization at the start. Not grandeur. Plasmo. The source also makes a subtle but important point about the land itself. Southern Mesopotamia was not obviously inviting. It had no abundance of building stone, no easy forests, no comforting natural defenses. Yet out of this land came writing, cities, schools, astronomy, and legal traditions. That does not prove anything mystical by itself. Of course, hard places often force innovation. But it does sharpen the main question. Why here? Why on a hot alluvial plain so dependent on managed water? Why did the first city the texts remember as divinely assigned rise in a place where survival depended on understanding rivers better than almost anyone else on earth? I have always found that question more interesting than the cheaper versions of ancient mystery. Not alien. Not easy sensationalism. Just the stubborn fact that the Sumerians repeatedly treated water, soil, and settlement pattern as though they were too important to be casual. Eridu is where that tone begins to acquire physical form. The source then widens from Eridu to the larger Sumerian world, and that widening matters because we are not dealing with one isolated shrine in mud. We are dealing with an entire civilization that assembled, within roughly a millennium, the essential grammar of organized urban life. Writing, monumental temples, schools, law, medicine, astronomy, irrigation systems sophisticated enough to feed cities. You can say that sentence quickly and not feel it. But if you slow down, it becomes extraordinary. A people in a harsh water-governed plain built the toolkit by which later civilizations would remember themselves. And they did so while speaking a language that still stands alone. The source lingers on Sumerian as a language isolate, and honestly, I have always found that fact more eerie than most mythic details. Languages usually arrive with relatives, cousin, clear traces, family trees. Sumerian sits there like a stone at the edge of a field, undeniably real, stubbornly itself, resistant to being fitted neatly into a larger ancestry. That does not mean it came from the stars. Of course, we should be better than that. But it does contribute to the atmosphere of strangeness surrounding the civilization. Their tongue, their cities, their first literary texts, their way of speaking about the world as if it had been deliberately apportioned. All of it gives the impression of a people who felt themselves to be inheritors of something already old when they themselves were young. You know that feeling when a civilization seems to enter history already carrying a memory. That is Sumer. The source then walks us through the great cities. With its royal tombs and lapis and gold. Nippur with its vast tablet collections. Uruk with its early writing and monumental scale. These details matter not just because they are impressive, but because they show how broad the Sumerian inheritance became. We are not dealing with a marginal or half-formed culture whose ideas can be dismissed as local curiosities. We are dealing with a civilization so foundational that much of the later ancient Near East inherited its categories, its stories, and its administrative habits. If such a civilization repeatedly speaks of Earth as surveyed, prepared, watered, and organized, then even if one ends up reading those statements as theology alone, one should at least listen carefully. I have always liked the old tablet houses too, the Adaba, where students copied texts line by line. There is something almost tender in imagining a boy in Nippur, long after the events described were already ancient, pressing the same signs into fresh clay that other boys had copied before him. He may not have understood every layer. He may have complained inwardly. His wrist may have ached. But because he copied carefully, the questions survived. Human civilization is held together by many things. One of them is the willingness of bored students to complete their assignments. The source is very aware of that chain of preservation, and I think it is one of the most beautiful parts of the whole story. Civilization did not only invent writing, it invented the habit of recopying what it thought mattered. That habit is why a museum drawer today can still trouble our sleep. Now, let us return for a moment to Eridu as the first city in the Sumerian memory. The source is wise not to overclaim the archaeology. It says, correctly, that archaeology with all its limits does not contradict the textual prestige of Eridu. That is a careful sentence, and a good one. Archaeology rarely gives us neat confirmations of literary grandeur. What it gives us are stubborn traces. Occupation, templates, layers, position in the landscape. Eridu has those traces. Enough to make the old claim feel less like fancy and more like an ancient memory attached to a very real place. Imagine the mound of Eridu long after abandonment, long after wind and sand and forgotten names. A rise in the desert. Broken mud brick. Silence. Then imagine the same place in the earliest period, alive with small ritual, practical labor, boats or marsh traffic not too far away, fresh water nearby. The first sacred architecture, making a claim that would echo for millennia. This was not merely one settlement among many. In the Sumerian imagination, it was the point where order first touched ground. That phrase may be the deepest thread running through the source so far. Order touched ground. Not anywhere. Here. And if that is how the Sumerians understood their beginning, then the question of Earth being chosen starts sounding less like a modern provocation and more like the native logic of their literature. A harsh but fertile world. A first city placed where water made life possible. A civilization that treats administration almost as sacred. A people who remember the beginning not as vague emergence but as assignment. I think this is why the landscape itself must be allowed to stay in the story as more than backdrop. The plain between the rivers is not scenery. It is evidence. The river courses, the marsh margins, the silt-rich earth, the dependence on managed water. All of these things become the physical conditions that later texts will praise, organize, and perhaps even frame as the reason this world was worth preparing. The land has not yet been explicitly surveyed by Enki in our narrative. The gods have not yet divided their domains. Mars has not yet appeared in red omen light, but already we can feel the stage being built. Earth, in the Sumerian frame, will be special, because this kind of land can become a city-bearing memory. So let the alluvial plain remain before you now. Bright, difficult, water-threaded, more fragile than a mountain kingdom and more productive than it first appears. Let Eridu rise near its sacred waters. Let those 18 temple levels stack quietly beneath the archaeologist's spades. Let the black-headed people continue building, counting, storing, teaching, and writing. In the next movement, the clay itself will learn to speak again through the long, patient labor of decipherment. And once that happens, the old questions pressed into those wedges will begin sounding far less like decorative myth and far more like a civilization trying very hard not to forget what kind of world it believed it had inherited. Once the land of Sumer is standing clearly before us, the source does something I love very much. It turns from marshlight and temple dust toward one of the strangest rescue stories in all of scholarship. The tablets had survived. Yes, they had crossed centuries, collapse, flood silt, war, theft, excavation, shipping, cataloging, and museum storage. But survival is not the same as speech. A tablet can endure for 5,000 years and still remain silent if no one alive can read its marks. That is where the next darkness enters. Not the darkness of burial now, but the darkness of lost language. I have always found lost writing more unsettling than ruined walls. A broken wall still admits that it was once a wall. A silent script can sit in front of your face and refuse even that much generosity. It can look deliberate, beautiful, careful, and still reveal nothing. Imagine the first modern viewers of cuneiform, standing before copied inscriptions or holding tablets whose wedge marks clearly carried order, repetition, spacing, and method. Yet meaning remained locked away. There is something almost painful in that image. A civilization had spoken, and the world could see that it had spoken, but could not yet hear a single word. The source wisely slows down here, because decipherment was not a magic act. It was not one inspired genius glancing at a sign and declaring the whole archive open. It was generations of patience, risk, ego, luck, comparison, copying, and the kind of stubborn attention that can look dull from outside and heroic from within. I think that matters. Ancient mysteries often get cheapened by the hunger for sudden revelation. Real revelation usually comes much more slowly. One copied sign, one comparison, one bilingual clue, one hypothesis surviving criticism instead of collapsing under it. Imagine the 19th century for a moment. European interest in the ancient Near East growing. Archaeology not yet fully professional. Ancient mounds being cut open by people driven by curiosity. Ambition, empire, religion, and genuine awe in various unstable combinations. Men stand in sun and dust over broken bricks and carved stones, fully aware that they are pulling an older world back into view, but not yet fully aware how much of that world will remain inaccessible until language itself is reopened. The source brings in Austin Henry Layard. And I think that is exactly right, because Layard belongs to the part of the story where excitement outruns understanding. He excavates at Nineveh and Nimrud, pulling reliefs, colossal, human-headed bulls, and eventually libraries of tablets into the field of vision of Europe. I have always liked the contrast there. Great carved figures come out first, and everyone knows at once that these are the remains of powerful civilizations. But the clay tablets, smaller and quieter, carry the deeper recovery. They do not impress from across a room as easily. They ask for reading. That means they ask for a future still waiting to be built. Then comes Behistun. Honestly, if you were standing with me beside a fire and I had to choose one single image to represent the stubborn beauty of decipherment, I might choose Behistun before any tablet at all. A cliff face in western Iran. A great inscription carved high into rock under Darius I. 3 languages, high enough and dangerous enough that copying it required nerve as much as intelligence. The source is right to pause there, because Behistun gave the 19th century the thing lost. Scripts often need most. A controlled bridge. Picture Henry Rawlinson on that cliff. Rope. Rock. Heat. Risk. A body suspended against stone, while lines of ancient signs are copied by hand. I have always found that image almost absurd in its devotion. Scholarship at a desk looks noble in portraits. Scholarship on a cliff with bad footing looks much closer to what it often really is. Faith that meaning exists and can be reached if one is willing to look foolish enough, long enough. Old Persian yielded first because it was alphabetic enough and historically constrained enough to offer a way in. Once that cracked, the multilingual structure of the inscription created comparison points. The process was not automatic. It was still difficult, disputed, and vulnerable to error. But suddenly, the wedge marks were no longer entirely mute. The door had opened a little. Akkadian, or what many at first treated under names like Assyrian or Babylonian, began to speak in more reliable ways. Royal inscriptions became readable. Names aligned. Titles aligned. Events aligned. History, at least in part, started coming back. The source then makes another essential point. Sumerian did not yield first. That matters because it keeps the story honest. The scholars first learned to hear later Mesopotamian voices more clearly, especially Akkadian in its various historical forms. Sumerian often appeared in bilingual or lexical lists, old scholarly texts copied by Mesopotamian scribes themselves who were already preserving an older sacred language through teaching and translation. I love that detail more every time I think about it. The Sumerians were eventually heard again, partly because later Mesopotamians had done the merciful work of teaching Sumerian to one another in antiquity. The dead civilization had been given a schoolroom afterlife by its cultural heirs. There is something deeply moving in that. A boy in an ancient tablet house copying sign lists, perhaps bored, perhaps tired, perhaps dreaming of anything other than lexical exercises. And because he does his work, scholars thousands of years later have one more foothold into a language that otherwise might have sunk past recovery. Human memory survives by humble labor more often than by dramatic genius. The source also brings in George Smith, and no retelling of cuneiform rediscovery feels complete without him. He was not an aristocratic excavator on a cliff. He was a banknote engraver turned Assyriologist. A man whose eye for small details on engraved surfaces translated beautifully into sensitivity to ancient script. I have always loved that sideways path into scholarship. History does not only open through official doors. Sometimes it opens because a person trained in one craft notices something others overlook. Picture the British Museum reading room or tablet room in those decades. Fragments everywhere. Dust. Labels. Shelves. Scholars bent over broken pieces, comparing edges, tracing signs, muttering values, arguing over grammar, trying to decide whether a wedge is broken, doubled, or copied badly by a student 3,000 years earlier. The room is probably not glamorous. Ink, paper, eye strain. Yet inside such rooms, the ancient Near East was returning clause by clause. Then George Smith finds and reads the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have always found the emotional force of that moment worth slowing down. A Victorian scholar in London, piecing together fragments from Nineveh and suddenly realizing he is reading a Mesopotamian flood narrative with startling overlaps to biblical tradition. The shock runs through the room, through newspapers, through theology, through public imagination. The source uses this as a hinge, and rightly so, because once the flood text became legible, educated people could no longer pretend Mesopotamian literature was a decorative curiosity. It had become a serious archive of ancient memory with the power to trouble familiar narratives at their roots. And of course, flood was only the beginning. The more tablets that were copied, joined, translated, and studied, the larger the archive became. Temple hymns, incantation, king lists, administrative records, creation stories, lexical lists, omens, letters, laws, school texts, scientific observation. We often speak of decipherment as though one code was cracked and everything followed in a rush. The reality is more like a city slowly relit window by window. At first, a few chambers glow, then a district, then avenues of meaning, then finally enough light exists to realize how much still remains dark. The source next turns us toward Nippur, and I am glad it does, because Nippur belongs not just to excavation history, but to the recovery of Sumerian intellectual life in bulk. The university excavations at Nippur brought out immense numbers of tablets, enough to change the scale of what could be known. I have always thought quantity matters in ancient studies more than outsiders realize. One text is revelation. 10,000 texts are a civilization. Repetition, variation, scribal habit, lexical teaching, liturgical continuity, administrative obsession. All of it begins to appear once the archive grows large enough. Imagine opening one crate after another and finding tablet after tablet, some whole, many broken, most unglamorous. Grain accounts, offerings, receipts, names, deliveries. Then among them, hymns, myths, and literary works copied and recopied across centuries. This is one reason I trust the tone of the source. It does not ask us to hang everything on a single dramatic fragment. It asks us to listen to a broad archive whose different genres still circle the same civilizational concerns. Water, order, kingship, cities, divine assignment, human labor, catastrophe, memory. The source also wisely reminds us that decipherment is never finished. That is another mark of honesty I appreciate. Sign values shift as scholarship improves. Fragments join. Old translations are revised. New photographs reveal traces missed before. Grammar becomes more precise. Some readings remain debated. We cannot be sure of every line, every nuance, every implied emphasis. But uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. Enough has been recovered to hear the broad shape of the Sumerian world with remarkable clarity. If you were standing in one of those museums now, looking through glass at a line of tablets from Nippur or Ur or Nineveh, you might feel that double truth at once. So much has been recovered. So much remains broken. It is a lovely, intellectual humility. We know enough to be troubled, not enough to become arrogant. I think that is one reason the source lingers on translation as human labor. We are not being asked to believe in a mystical download from the past. We are being asked to trust a chain of effort. Excavators in heat, copyists on cliffs, museum curators, philologists comparing sign lists, editors building grammars, students learning dead languages, scholars correcting one another across generations. All that labor stands between us and the sentence. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, and all that labor stands behind the quieter claim now forming in our minds, that the Sumerians may have regarded earth not as an afterthought, but as prepared ground. You know that feeling when the recovery of evidence becomes almost as moving as the evidence itself. That is where I am with cuneiform. The tablets survived, yes. But what makes them haunting is that people refuse to let survival be enough. They wanted understanding. They wanted the old voices back. And because they persisted, the wedges now say more than names. They tell us how the first civilization imagined the beginning. So let the scene settle. The cliff at Behistun, the dust of Nineveh, the tablet rooms in London, the trenches at Nippur, the school texts copied by ancient boys, the scholars tracing wedges by lamplight, all of it converging toward one strange reward. Clay speaking again. In the next movement, once the archive is audible, we have to listen to one of its most unsettling declarations in full, the king list and its claim that kingship descended from heaven, because that line now returns with far more weight once we understand how much effort it took simply to hear it. Now that the clay can speak again, the source turns us toward one of the texts that refuses to behave like a harmless relic. The Sumerian king list. I have always thought the king list becomes more unsettling the longer you spend with it, not less. At first glance, people often notice only the famous absurdity. The reign lengths so vast they seem to belong to another species of time. tens of thousands of years. Kings holding office longer than whole civilizations. It is easy to laugh, or shrug, or file the text away as sacred exaggeration and move on. But the source does not let us move on, and I think that is exactly right. Because the most important thing in the king list is not how long the kings reigned. It is how kingship arrives. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu. I know I already gave you that line, but now it returns with more depth because the tablets are no longer mute objects. We know what it cost to hear them. We know how many scholars and scribes and excavators stand behind the sentence. And once it comes back in that fuller light, it sounds less like a curiosity and more like the first structural claim in a worldview. Kingship is not invented here. It is transferred here. The text is not merely naming a political institution. It is naming an origin. The source brings in the Weld-Blundell prism at this point, and that is wise because the prism itself deserves a moment. 4 inscribed sides. Clay turned into a rotating archive, a shape that almost invites ritual handling, though what we now see is museum stillness. I have always found prisms more eerie than tablets. Tablets lie flat and seem humble. Prisms stand and turn and suggest a world arranged by faces, orders, and repeating views. When you imagine the king list wrapped around that object, it begins to feel like something between record and monument. Picture it under museum light. The clay a little darker than the pale pen fragment from before. The columns of wedges steady and careful. Each line copied because someone believed the sequence mattered. Eridu first, then Bat Tibira, then Larak, Sibir, Shuruppak. Cities receiving kingship one after another like stations in a system. That sequence matters deeply. The list does not describe humanity wandering into urban life by slow accident. It describes rulership being located, positioned, moved. I have always thought the city sequence is one of the quietest and strongest clues in the entire corpus, because cities here are not random dots on a map. They are the first recipients of a descending institution. If kingship is a charge, then cities are receiving sites. If governance comes from above, then earth is a surface on which placement occurs. The source is careful, again, not to overstate. Some scholars read the king list primarily as political theology, a later scribal attempt to impose order and legitimacy on the tangled memory of many dynasties. I think that is a fair and serious reading. We cannot be sure the text is preserving a literal chronological chain of real rulers all the way back into prehistory. It may be shaping memory to express kingship as a single stream granted by the gods and moving from city to city in an idealized line. But notice something important. Even that cautious reading still leaves the central phrase untouched. Whether literal, symbolic, or liturgical in function, kingship is still described as descending, not emerging. That is the line the source keeps its hand on, and so will I. Because if the text had wanted merely to flatter old rulers, it had many simpler options. It could say kingship flourished. Kingship arose. Kingship began with wise ancestors. But no, it descends. The word choice places governance in the same category as gift, burden, endowment, perhaps even a kind of technology of order. I have always found that a little chilling in the best way. Civilization in the Sumerian memory is not the innocent blooming of village life. It is the arrival of structure. The source then moves into the famous pre-flood section. And here we should slow down rather than pretend the difficulty is not there. Alulim reigning for 28,800 years. Alongar for 36,000. Other kings receiving reigns measured not in plausible human lifetimes, but in vast symbolic spans. It is tempting to let those numbers overshadow everything else. Modern minds dislike impossible scales unless they come from astrophysics. But the source does something smarter. It asks what kind of thinking those numbers belong to. I think there are at least 3 quiet possibilities sitting there. 1. The numbers are symbolic, expressing remoteness, greatness, or a different quality of primordial time rather than ordinary chronology. 2. The numbers preserve some damaged memory of older counting systems, now inflated or mistransmitted through copies and conversions scholars still debate. 3. The text deliberately marks the pre-flood kings as belonging to a world unlike the one after the flood, where time itself behaves differently in the imagination. None of those options gives us easy certainty, but all of them still support the main impression. The earliest order of kingship belongs to a realm closer to heaven than to normal history. And that is what makes the flood so important in the list. The flood is not merely a catastrophe here. It is a boundary. Before the flood, cities and kings stand in one strange scale of memory. After the flood, the kingship descends again, and the historical texture becomes somewhat more recognizable, though never simple. I have always loved that reset. It is administrative even in its devastation. The system pauses or breaks, and then the institution returns to earth under altered conditions. That tells you something profound about how the Sumerians thought. Flood does not abolish the need for order. It interrupts and reassigns it. Imagine a scribe copying those lines in an old tablet house. Before the flood, after the kingship descended from heaven, then the flood swept over. Then, after the flood had swept over, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. I want you to hear the repetition there. Descended from heaven once more. That is not sloppy phrasing. It is doctrinal insistence. The institution returns from above because above is still its source. The source also points out how strategic the earliest cities look in the larger alluvial landscape, and I think that observation deserves to sit with us for a while. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipper, Shuruppa. These are not fantasy locations scattered at whim. They belong to real geographies, real water systems, real zones of productivity and sacred significance in ancient Mesopotamia. Once again, the old administrative tone returns. Placement matters. The first network of cities appears almost like nodes on a planned surface. You know that feeling when a map begins to look less like settlement drift and more like design. That is exactly the mood the source wants here. I have always thought the word design makes people nervous too quickly in ancient studies, perhaps because it attracts bad arguments. So let me soften it. Planned relation, deliberate sequence, structured placement. These phrases are quieter and perhaps truer. The king list may be theological. It may be political. It may also preserve the ancient conviction that civilized order was laid onto earth according to a pattern not of purely human making. The source then does something subtle and very convincing. It shifts focus away from the kings themselves and toward the institution they carry. That is the right move. The kings may be legendary, composite, or liturgically amplified, but kingship remains the star of the text. Kingship moves. Kingship settles. Kingship is held by a city, then another. It behaves almost like a sacred object or charge. This is why the line about descending from heaven matters more than the biographies of the rulers. The text is tracking transfer, not personality. I think that is one reason the king list still feels so alien. Modern people are accustomed to thinking of governance as a human construction, messy, improvised, negotiated, often crude. The king list presents it as a cosmic allocation, something that has to arrive before cities fully become themselves. That is a radically different emotional universe. It means Earth is not just a habitat. It is a receiving surface for institutions. And if that is true, then our question sharpens again. If governance was received here, where was it before? In what sense did heaven possess kingship prior to its descent? Was heaven in the Sumerian mind simply the divine realm of legitimacy, making the sentence theological in a broad sense? Or did the repeated insistence preserve a more concrete intuition? That ordered civilization on earth was thought of as imported, bestowed, assigned into place. The source does not force a final answer, and I will not either. But it is hard to read the line honestly and feel nothing. The source also notes how the list creates continuity across dynasties and cities, turning many local traditions into one descending river of legitimacy. That is politically brilliant. Of course, scribes do this sort of thing because states need memory to look cleaner than reality. But once again, political utility does not cancel mythic meaning. In fact, it often depends on it. The list works as ideology precisely because people found the cosmological idea persuasive. Kingship from heaven made sense to them. That alone is enough to keep our question alive. Picture the plane again, this time from above in imagination. Marsh edges, river channels, bright land, temple mounds rising at points of concentration. Now, imagine those points not merely as where people happen to settle first, but as receivers in a descending sequence of order. I have always found that image both beautiful and unnerving. Beautiful because it gives civilization a pattern. Unnerving because it suggests civilization was never thought of as fully our own invention. There is another sadness hidden in the text, too. If kingship descends, it can also be withdrawn. If it is transferred, it can move on. No city owns it by right forever. The source hints at that, and I think it is important. Sumerian political theology is not flattering in the naive sense. It gives legitimacy, yes, but it also makes all earthly power provisional. That is one reason the list matters for our larger question about Earth. A world that receives order can also lose it. A chosen place can still fail its role. And that thought leads almost perfectly into the next text the source wants us to hear. Atrahasis. Because once kingship has descended and cities have been placed, the next question becomes even more concrete. What exactly was done to Earth before humanity entered the story? What work prepared this world to receive cities, labor, governance, and eventually people? In the next movement, the gods themselves begin digging canals for 3,600 years, and Earth starts looking less like a passive backdrop and more like a managed project whose surface had to be made ready before civilization could begin. Before we leave the prism entirely, let me hold you for one more moment beside it. Imagine the scribe who copied it not as a modern skeptic collecting folklore, but as a custodian of order. His hand presses one wedge after another into damp clay, and every line says the same quiet thing in a different form. Civilization is not self-born. It is received. The city is not enough by itself. It must be joined to legitimacy. The flood is not enough by itself. Order must descend again. I have always found that repetitive discipline beautiful. It means the text is not merely remembering kings. It is defending a philosophy of Earth, that this world became fully itself only when a higher pattern touched it and took root in particular places. Once the king list has finished its slow and unsettling work, once kingship has descended from heaven and touched Eridu and the first cities in sequence, the source takes us into an even stranger register. Governance is no longer enough. A city can receive kingship only if the ground below it has already been made workable, watered, cut, measured, and held inside some larger order. This is where Atrahasis enters. And I have always thought Atrahasis feels less like a fairy tale than people expect. It has gods. Certainly. It has divine speech, divina anger, divine creation. Yet beneath all that sacred language there is a mood of labor, burden, assignment, and system strain. It sounds, in other words, like administration under pressure. The source opens this phase by reminding us that the cosmos in Atrahasis is divided before humanity appears. Anu takes the sky. Enlil takes the earth. Enki, in the deep and fertile sense that belongs only to him, takes the subterranean waters, the fresh, hidden wealth of the Abzu. I have always loved that first partitioning because it immediately tells you what kind of world you have entered. This is not a creation story where reality spills outward in one ecstatic burst and then somehow settles itself. It is a story where domains are allocated, powers are assigned, jurisdiction comes before comfort. The gods themselves seem to think in structure. Imagine the early world of this text before human beings arrive. Not empty exactly. Not chaotic in the modern cinematic sense. More like a great unfinished estate. Sky above. Earth below. Waters hidden and waiting in the deep. The outlines exist, but the place is not yet livable in the organized Sumerian way. Rivers are not yet obedient. Canals are not yet cut. The land that might later carry cities has not yet been persuaded into productivity. It is a world with potential and with burden, and burden always has to fall on someone. In Atrahasis, that someone is first the younger gods. I have always found the younger gods in this story unexpectedly moving. They are divine, yes, but their complaint is deeply familiar. They work, they dig, they maintain. They carry the heavy labor required to make Earth productive, and after long ages, they can no longer bear it. The source is right to dwell on the length of this labor, 3,600 years. Whether we read that figure literally, symbolically, or liturgically, it does what it is supposed to do. It stretches the imagination. It tells you that the preparation of Earth was not a quick gesture. It was immense work, repetitive work, dirty work, the kind of work that changes not only the land, but the morale of those performing it. Picture the younger gods in the deep heat of the alluvial plain. Though, of course, the scene is mythic and not documentary in any simple sense. Still, the imagery matters. Spades into wet earth, canal lines opening where there had been none, embankments raised, river paths corrected, mud against skin, water diverted, the body rhythm of collective labor repeating without end. I think one of the reasons this text feels so potent is that it imagines civilization from underneath. Before there are scribes, templars, and kings, there is infrastructure. Before there is administration, there is exhaustion. The source keeps its ear close to that exhaustion, and I am glad it does. Too often, people read ancient myth as though its only job were to entertain or bewilder. Atrahasis does something subtler. It dramatizes a truth every irrigation society knew in its bones. Productive land is not just there. It is maintained. Water must be persuaded. Channels must be cut. Silt must be managed. Labor must be organized. The divine labor of Atrahasis gives cosmic scale to that very earthly understanding. Earth is not the place where civilization casually appears. Earth is the place where civilization is worked into existence. I have always thought that is why the revolt of the younger gods lands with such force. They do not rebel over a philosophical abstraction. They rebel over work. They burn their tools. They surround the house of Enlil. They refuse the burden any longer. There is something almost modern in that image, which may be one reason it remains so vivid. Yet the source is wise not to flatten it into modern politics. This is still myth, still liturgy, still a sacred memory of why humans exist. But the pressure of labor is the hinge. Humanity is created not out of divine whimsy, but because a project needs maintaining. That sentence should be allowed to settle. Humanity is created because the workload is too great. It is one of the darkest and most revealing ideas in the whole Mesopotamian archive. In some traditions, humans are made out of love. In others, out of overflow, curiosity, or divine pleasure. In Atrahasis, they are made because a project needs maintaining. I do not say that to make the story sound crueler than it is. In a strange way, it is also dignifying. It makes human life central to the ongoing management of Earth. We are not ornaments here. We are laborers inside a system already in motion. The source emphasizes the technical vocabulary around river cutting and canal digging, and that is essential. These are not vague acts of elemental shaping. They are specific. Channels, watercourses, field systems, structured redirection. The language sounds less like pure fantasy and more like the mythic elevation of irrigation labor into sacred precedent. I have always loved that ancient texts can do this. Make a canal feel cosmic without ceasing to know that it is also a canal. Imagine the first water entering a newly cut channel. The bank still dark from recent digging. The current slow at first, then steadier. Little collapses of wet earth at the edge. The sound soft but decisive. A line of land that was not productive yesterday becoming potentially fertile tomorrow because somebody, or in this case some divine class of somebodies, carried enough labor into the place to change its fate. That is the emotional grammar of Atrahasis. Earth becomes habitable through work, not sentiment. The source also makes a beautiful point about how formal the whole divine response feels once the younger gods revolt. They do not simply stop working and then chaos follows. There is consultation, councils, deliberation. A solution is designed. I think this matters enormously for our larger question. If Earth were only one more random stage for mythic events, the response might be more spontaneous, more theatrical. Instead, the story behaves like the management of a strained estate. A labor problem emerges. The burden is reassessed. A new workforce is created. Even the origin of humanity sounds like policy. I have always found Enki fascinating here because his presence changes the emotional temperature of every story he enters. Enlil bears authority. A new distance. Enki, intelligence in motion. Whenever practical complexity appears, you can almost feel the text leaning toward him. Vata, cleverness, mixture, adaptation, hidden knowledge. He belongs to those things as naturally as flame belongs to a hearth. In Atrahasis, the solution to the divine labor crisis requires precisely that sort of intelligence. Humanity is not improvised from nothing. Humanity is assembled through ritual, clay, blood, and design. The source is correct to linger on clay here too. Clay returns again and again in Mesopotamian imagination because clay is not simply material. It is the earth made shapeable by water. It is land persuaded into form. It is memory before firing, body before breath. A people who built with mud brick, wrote on clay tablets, modeled divine and human form in clay, and watched rivers create soil year after year, were never going to treat clay as dead matter. Clay was earth in its most cooperative mood. Picture the clay prepared for human creation in the imagination of the text. Vent, dense, cool to the touch, gathered perhaps in sacred space, worked by divine hands, mixed with what the story calls for, so that something more than mud can emerge. I have always thought that scene should be read slowly, not because it is sentimental, but because it says so much about how Mesopotamians imagined embodiment. Humans are not made out of distant starlight. We are made of the very ground the system is trying to make productive. We belong to the labor site from the beginning. And yet the source never lets that insight become too soft. Humanity is not made to stroll. Humanity is made to bear. The younger gods need relief. The channels need maintaining. The fields need tending. The work of earth continues. This is why the story contributes so much to the larger thesis. Earth is not represented as a finished paradise, handed over complete. It is represented as a prepared but demanding domain whose productivity requires structured service. If Earth was chosen, it was not chosen because it was effortless. It was chosen because it could sustain a system worth sustaining. You know that feeling when a place becomes more impressive after you realize how much invisible labor keeps it alive? That is Earth in Atrahasis. The beauty of water and fertility is not erased, but it is deepened by effort. Rivers do not simply bless. They must be handled. Land does not simply yield. It must be managed. The whole world gains a kind of practical holiness. The source also draws attention to the number 3,600. And even if one does not wish to lean too hard on numerology, it is impossible to ignore how deliberately large and structured the number feels. It suggests a complete span, a full cycle, a labor age sufficient to prepare the ground before a new phase begins. I like that because it gives the world a sequence. First, division of domains, then labor, then exhaustion, then the making of humanity. Earth does not simply happen. It proceeds through stages of readiness. That readiness is the point. I have always thought we should listen carefully whenever ancient texts speak as though a world had to be made ready. Readiness implies criteria. Readiness implies suitability. Readiness implies that not every place, or not every state of a place, is fit for what is to come next. The source never claims more than it can support, but this is exactly where its question starts feeling powerful. If the Sumerians repeatedly imagine Earth as a domain worked on before humans entered the picture, then their literature may preserve not merely a creation myth, but a memory of selection through preparation. There is another subtle beauty in Atrahasis too. The labor of the younger gods is mostly about water and earth, not about the stars. That matters. This story is deeply terrestrial. Its imagination is grounded in canals, embankments, fields, gardens, food, and noise. It is the myth of a civilization whose fate was tied to irrigation and administrative control. That is why Earth feels central here in a way no distant celestial body could. This is the world where fresh water can be redirected. This is the world where fields can answer labor with grain. This is the world where a project of civilization can actually be run. And when human beings finally enter the story, they enter not as dreamers first, nor philosophers first, nor even worshippers first, but workers in a sacred economy of maintenance. I admit I find that a little grim and a little comforting at the same time. Grim because the burden is real. Comforting because purpose is real too. The human race is not peripheral in Atrahasis. It is necessary. Earth is not indifferent to us. Earth is the site where our work matters. The source is wise to let all this accumulate slowly. One could quote the famous lines and move on too quickly, but then the emotional architecture would be lost. The emotional architecture is this. Earth needed labor before civilization. Labor produced strain. Strain required a new class of being. Humanity emerged into a world already under management. That sequence makes Earth look less like a passive backdrop and more like a managed project. Now let the scene settle for a moment. The younger gods tired beyond patience. The canal cuts dark against the plain. Water entering the new channels. Councils murmuring under divine authority. Clay gathered for a new solution. The first humans, not yet breathing, but already implied by the burden of the world. In the next movement, the source will bring in Enki and the world order. And there the feeling of preparation becomes even sharper. Because Earth is not only worked on, it is surveyed, measured, assigned, and filled with abundance as though someone were laying a blueprint over land already judged worth the effort. After Atrahasis has shown us a world under labor, a world whose rivers and fields must be dug, directed, and maintained before human beings can properly take their place inside it. The source moves into a text that feels, to me, even stranger in a quieter way. Not because it is more dramatic. In fact, it is less dramatic. There are no striking laborers here. No angry confrontation outside Enlil's door. No urgent solution to a divine strike. What we get instead is something cooler, more methodical, almost administrative in the modern sense. Enki and the world order. I've always found Enki easier to underestimate at first glance. Perhaps because he is rarely the loudest figure in a room. Enlil can dominate a scene with authority. Inanna can electrify one with brilliance and danger. Nergal darkens everything he touches. But Enki enters differently. He surveys. He apportions. He notices. He solves. He is the intelligence that moves through water and through systems. When a text begins sounding like assessment, measurement, or ordered abundance, I start looking for him almost automatically. The source is exactly right to make him central here, because in Enki and the world order, Earth begins to feel not merely cultivated, but evaluated. That distinction matters. Atrahasis gives us the labor of preparation. This text gives us the logic of distribution. Rivers are not just channels cut by burdened gods. They become assigned sources of fertility. Fields are not just open ground. They become managed domains with roles. Rain, sea, marsh, fish, reeds, livestock, grain, crafts, all of them enter an economy of ordered competence. The world begins to sound like a territory under survey. Picture Enki at the edge of the two great rivers in the imagination of the poem. Not hurrying, not guessing. Standing with the confidence of one who understands both deep water and useful water, both hidden abundance and visible flow. The Tigris and Euphrates are not background in this scene. They are the first great instruments of civilization. The source lingers on the way Enki fills them, praises them, directs them toward productivity. And I think that is exactly right. River language in Sumerian literature is never innocent. Water is potential waiting for intelligence. I have always loved surveying imagery because it feels so physical and so abstract at once. A measuring cord stretched over land. a rod held upright in the morning light, an eye trained not only to see what is there, but what can be done with what is there. That is Enki in this text. He does not create by singing alone. He creates through assignment. If you were standing beside him in imagination, you might hear less thunder than calculation, less chaos than arrangement, less eruption than the slow confidence of a builder who already sees the finished plan within the unfinished ground. The source makes a strong point about the surveying rod and measuring cord, and that may be one of the most important details in the entire case, because once measuring appears, suitability appears with it. A place is not measured unless it matters. A river is not assessed unless its flow can serve something. A field is not assigned unless its yield belongs inside a wider structure. I do not say that to force the text into some modern engineering fantasy. I say it because the emotional tone of the poem itself invites it. This is the language of someone laying an order over a landscape already considered worthy of order. There is something deeply soothing in that if you let yourself hear it properly. The world is not flung outward at random. It is cared for by intelligence. And yet, it is also eerie. Because intelligence implies criteria. The source is careful not to overplay the speculation, but it does raise a possibility I think is worth keeping in the room. When a text speaks again and again of earth as measured, filled, assigned, and made abundant, one begins to wonder whether the underlying imagination assumes comparison. Not necessarily comparison with Mars in a modern planetary science sense, though that contrast will come more fully later. But comparison in a broader cosmological sense. Some regions are fertile. Some are barren. Some domains sustain life. Others sustain death, dryness, or chaos. Earth in the Sumerian frame repeatedly appears as the domain where managed abundance is possible. That is already a kind of selection. Imagine the first survey of a field after floodwater has withdrawn. Mud still dark. Reed stubble at the edges. Air carrying both dampness and the beginning of heat. Someone, divine in the poem, human in later practice, stretches the line, marks the edge, judges the water, calculates the channel, decides what can live here and what cannot. That is not merely observation. That is the beginning of civilization. Enki embodies that threshold, the movement from given land to organized world. The source also reminds us that Enki is not assigning only land and water in a narrow sense. He is assigning the functions that make a world habitable and socially coherent. Sea, rain, marshes, livestock, crafts, grain, even the arts and forms of skill that later human life will depend on. I have always found that detail profoundly revealing. Civilization, in this text, is not just brick and canal. It is a total ecology of roles. The world is made livable by differentiation. Everything has a domain. Everything has a keeper. Everything has a place in the larger weave. That is why the poem feels so much like blueprint literature to me. I use that phrase gently, but I think it fits. Not blueprint in the mechanical modern sense of technical drawings alone, but blueprint in the older sacred sense, a pattern laid over raw possibility so that abundance becomes reliable. The source does well to linger over this because it pushes our central question in a new direction. Earth is not merely a place that receives cities after long labor. Earth is a place whose systems are judged capable of receiving and sustaining organized life. I have always thought capability is one of the most interesting hidden ideas in ancient cosmology. We moderns often speak as though existence is enough. But ancient people knew better. A river can exist and still be useless. A plane can exist and still starve. Rain can exist and still destroy. Capability emerges only when conditions align and intelligence can work with them. Enki is the god of that alignment. The source lets the Tigris and Euphrates remain central, and they should remain central. If you want to understand why the Sumerians could imagine Earth as chosen, you have to feel what those rivers meant. Not picturesque waterways, but moving lifelines. The difference between harvest and hunger. The routes of transport, trade, communication, ritual geography, and political power. The very veins through which the first cities pulsed. No wonder the poems speak of them with praise. No wonder a god of wisdom and deep water stands over their arrangement. A civilization that depends on rivers will eventually speak of good rivers the way others speak of miracles. Picture dawn over the Euphrates in early spring. Mist low over the surface. The bank soft underfoot. The current broad and almost deceptively calm. Somewhere farther off, the land beyond the floodplain waiting for the canal cuts that will let it join the civilized world. If you were standing there, you would understand at once why measurement could feel sacred. One cut here, another there, one gate, one channel, and a wasteland becomes field. Enki, in the logic of the poem, is the divinity of that knowing. The source also notes that the poem feels less like blind creation and more like inspection followed by assignment. I think that is one of its strongest observations. Inspection. Assignment. Those are administrative words, but they fit. The god does not wander in surprise through Earth's features. He recognizes them, names them, and places them into function. That is a very different emotional atmosphere from myth as improvisation. It suggests Earth already possesses the right kind of structure to be turned toward abundance. You know that feeling when a skilled person walks into a room and instantly sees what can be made of it. The room has not changed yet, but possibility has sharpened. That is what Enki feels like in this text. He enters, and the world becomes legible. I have always found that one of the most beautiful things about intelligence, it does not always create from nothing. Sometimes it notices correctly, and noticing correctly is what allows everything else to follow. In that sense, Enki is the patron not only of water and wisdom, but of fit. The fit between river and field, between resource and role, between place and plan. If Earth is chosen in the Sumerian imagination, then Enki's gaze is one of the ways that chosenness becomes real. There is another layer here, too. One, the source suggests, without forcing. Earth in these poems is not the only realm in existence. Sky exists. The deep exists. Later, underworld traditions complicate the map further. What makes Earth feel special is not that it is the only thing, but that it is the habitable middle where abundance can be managed. That middle quality matters more than we sometimes notice. Too high and life cannot root. Too low and it disappears into dark or sterile depths. Earth is the level where water can rise, grain can grow, and cities can hold. That is why Enki, Lord of the Abzu, is such a crucial figure for the entire theory. He governs not barren water, not dead water, but life-giving fresh water beneath the land. The source will dwell more fully on the Abzu later, but already its presence shadows every assignment in this poem. The reason Earth can be organized at all is that it has hidden reserves worth organizing. Fresh water beneath, great rivers above, fertile silt between. I have always thought that hydrological imagination is the real heart of Sumerian chosenness. A world is not special because it glows. It is special because it can be watered. The source also gives us abundance as a category rather than as a decorative flourish. This matters. Abundance is not mere excess. It is the repeatable capacity of a system to feed, clothe, sustain, and support structured life. When Enki assigns cattle, grain, fish, reeds, and crafts, he is not scattering blessings at random. He is establishing a living order. The world under his hand becomes productive in stable ways. And stability is the dream of every irrigation civilization. The river must come, but not too violently. The field must yield, but not fail. The city must store enough for lean years. The gods must keep the pattern intact. This is not pastoral innocence. It is managed abundance under constant threat of breakdown. I think that is why the poem feels both calm and tense at once. Calm because everything is being placed. Tense because whatever is placed can later be disturbed. Once a system exists, the possibility of misrule, drought, flood, noise, overburden, and collapse enters the picture. The very order that makes civilization possible also makes civilization fragile. The source will use that tension later when it returns to the flood traditions, and rightly so. But even here, in the surveying phase, you can already sense the edge. A measured world is a vulnerable world because it now has measurable losses. There is another tenderness in the text that I do not want to miss. Enki does not merely assign grand features. He also attends to the smaller practicalities that make a landscape livable. Marsh, resources, fish, reeds. These things matter enormously in southern Mesopotamia. Reeds become roofs, mats, boats, baskets, writing tools. Fish become food. Marshes become resource fields rather than dead margins. I love that because it means the poem is not floating above life in a haze of cosmic generality. It knows the real stuff of living. It knows that a chosen world must also provide the humble materials of daily survival. You know that feeling when a theory becomes more convincing because it notices the little things. That is this poem. It does not merely say Earth is good. It shows why. So let this part rest for a moment, with Enki standing over a world becoming legible. Rivers filled, fields assigned, crafts distributed, the measuring cord stretched over land that can answer it. Earth no longer just worked, but surveyed into meaning. In the next movement, the source will move outward again, toward the stars and the planets, toward Nergal and Mars and the dry domains that stand in contrast to this wet middle world. And once that contrast appears, the question grows quieter and sharper at the same time. If the Sumerians knew of other cosmic regions and repeatedly described Earth as the place of fresh water, fertility, and managed abundance, then perhaps the oldest clay archive on Earth was not simply describing where we live. It was trying to remember why this world, of all worlds in their imagination, was the one worth preparing for civilization. By the time Enki has surveyed the rivers and laid a kind of living blueprint over the land, the source is ready to widen the frame again. Not downward now into clay and canals, and not sideways into king lists and city sequences, but upward into the sky. Toward the stars the Mesopotamians watched with such disciplined care. I have always loved this turn, because it reminds us that the Sumerians were never only mud and brick people. They were sky readers. Night after night they climbed roofs, watched horizons, recorded risings, settings, colors, irregular motions, and built a cosmic vocabulary in which no bright wandering object was meaningless. If we want to know whether Earth seemed chosen in their imagination, then we have to see what Earth was being silently compared to. The source chooses Mars for that comparison, and I think that is exactly right. Not because the Sumerians ever wrote a modern scientific line saying Earth was selected over Mars in the language of contemporary astronomy. They did not. We should not ask them to become 20th century planetary scientists in Reed stylus clothing. But they did map meanings onto the heavens. They did connect planets with divine powers. They did distinguish between domains of fertility, order, violence, drought, plague, and death. And when they looked at the red wandering star we call Mars, they did not see a symbol of flourishing field systems or sacred freshwater abundance. They saw Nergal. I have always found Nergal to be one of the most chilling gods in the Mesopotamian world, not because he is loud in the modern horror sense, but because he belongs to all the thinning places of life. War, pestilence, summer heat at its most punishing, the underworld, cities struck by plague, fields made useless. He is not simply death in a clean philosophical form. He is death as atmosphere, death as pressure, death as the sense that vigor has drained out of the land and left it dry. That is why the source lingers on him. Mars in the Mesopotamian sky was not simply red. It was red with association. Imagine the night roof of a temple or scribal house in Mesopotamia, air finally cooler after the oppressive weight of day. The plain dark beneath a wide sky. The horizon low and open enough that celestial motion can be watched with almost painful clarity. A priest or scholar stands there with practiced eyes, perhaps with waxboard or tablet nearby, and among the steadier lights, one red point draws the mind. Not fixed, moving, distinct. I have always thought the emotional effect of such sky watching must have been stronger than ours. We look up through the haze of modern life. They looked up because the sky itself was part of administration. Time, omen, danger, odor, all of it moved above them. The source makes a subtle but powerful contrast here. Mars belongs to Nergal, and Nergal belongs to drying, plague, war, and the underworld. Earth, by contrast, is repeatedly imagined through sweet water, river, breath, fertile fields, and organized life. This does not mean the Sumerians thought Earth was paradise. They knew drought too well for that. They knew flood, disease, crop failure, and the long ache of uncertain seasons. But their sacred imagination still placed Earth, or at least the civilized middle world, on the side of managed abundance rather than dead redness. In the emotional map of the cosmos, that difference matters enormously. You know that feeling when one image makes another image suddenly clearer by contrast. A fresh reed marsh seems more alive after you have pictured a dry battlefield. A full irrigation channel seems more miraculous after you have imagined stone and thirst. That is exactly what Mars does in the source. It becomes the silent negative of Earth. Not a literal sister world compared through telescopes, but a theological foil. One domain associated with blood color, wasting, and underworld descent. The other with freshwater depth, grain, templa, and sustained settlement. And that brings us to the Abzu. Honestly, I think the Abzu may be the deepest key in the entire case. More than kingship descending. More than impossible rains. More than flood. The Abzu is where the Sumerian imagination tells us, in its own language, why this world mattered. The Abzu is not simply water. It is sweet water, hidden water, fresh water beneath the earth, feeding springs, wells, channels, fertility, life. In a region where salt could ruin soil and fresh water was the difference between order and hunger. This distinction was not poetic decoration. It was reality at its most sacred. The source is absolutely right to bring Eridu back into the picture here, because Eridu belongs above all to Enki, Lord of the Abzu. I have always found that pairing beautiful. The first city in memory stands at the edge of sacred freshwater depth. The god of wisdom, craft, and productive intelligence rules the underground sweet waters. Civilization begins not with mountain stone or forest abundance, but with hidden fresh water brought into relationship with land. That does not feel accidental. It feels like the Sumerians were telling us exactly what kind of world is worth preparing. One that can be watered from below as well as above. Picture the sacred pool at Eridu before dawn. Still surface. Reed edges holding shadows. Temple silence, not yet broken by the movements of day. Somewhere beneath the visible pool, in the imagination of the worshipper, the great freshwater deep extends outward, concealed but potent, a reservoir of possibility under the very ground. I have always thought that image carries more explanatory power than people realize. A world with hidden fresh water is a world that can sustain cities. A world without it is a world of exposure. The Abzu is not only sacred geography, it is suitability. The source also does something wise with the language of the middle world. Mesopotamian cosmology is not flat. There is heaven. There is the underworld. There is the deep. There is the earth between, where human and civic life actually happen. That middleness matters. Earth is not just one location among many. It is the domain in which the right balance exists. Too high and you enter the remote, radiant, but not cultivable regions of divine distance. Too low and you descend toward darkness, sterility, imprisonment, or death. The habitable world sits in between, fed by water, open to sky, able to hold grain, animals, writing, and law. I have always found that middle quality profoundly moving. It means chosenness in the Sumerian frame is not glamour. It is fitness. Earth is the place where conditions align closely enough that organized life can take hold. That is a quieter and more convincing kind of sacredness than simple flattery. The source also lets the planetary comparison remain partly speculative, and that is another sign of honesty. We cannot be sure every Sumerian thinker sat beneath the stars imagining alternative habitable worlds in the way modern people do. That would be too neat. But we can say this much safely. They knew the heavens were populated with meaningful bodies. They gave those bodies character. They linked Mars with Nergal. They linked Earth, especially in its sacred literary form, with fresh water, fertility, and organized abundance. The comparison does not have to be literal to be revealing. It tells us what kind of world they believed they lived in, and what kind they feared. Imagine a scribe finishing the record of an ominous red planetary appearance, then walking the next morning past a canal bank thick with mud and life. One world above, associated with plague and death. Another below his feet, difficult but fertile, made generous by water. That contrast would not need philosophical explanation. It would be felt in the body. This is why the source feels persuasive to me. It does not ask us to believe the Sumerians had modern planetary science. It asks us to notice the consistent sacred value they assign to the qualities Earth uniquely displayed in their experience. Fresh water, fertility, habitability, the capacity to host order. And once the Abzu is in view, even Enki looks slightly different. Earlier, he was the surveyor, the administrator, the one who recognized a land worth organizing. Now we see why he could do that. He belongs to the hidden sweetness beneath the surface. He is not simply clever. He is clever in a world that actually contains the resources worth his cleverness. I think that is one of the most beautiful hidden ideas in Sumerian myth. Intelligence flourishes where there is something to tend. Wisdom is not enough by itself. It needs a world capable of answering it. The source also points out that life in southern Mesopotamia depended on understanding not just surface rivers, but the broader water system, marshes, springs, and the mysterious persistence of fertility in a place otherwise so exposed. That is why sweet water becomes almost metaphysical. It is not only useful, it is a sign that this world was built with inner generosity. Even in a harsh land, life rises from below. I have always thought that is what gives the Abzu its unique spiritual force. It is hidden mercy. You know that feeling when one simple natural fact changes the meaning of an entire civilization. Fresh water beneath the earth is like that here. So let the contrast sharpen once more. Mars, red, wandering, associated with Nergal, with war, plague, dryness, and the underworld. Earth, muddy, difficult, but fed from below, crossed by rivers, made fit for cities, the place of reeds, fish, cattle, grain, kingship, and writing. The Sumerians may never have staged a modern debate between planets, but their symbolic universe clearly knew the difference between a sterile domain and a life-bearing one. And that difference is the heart of the mystery. Earth keeps receiving what the other domains do not. Lavur, survey, freshwater reverence. The first cities, the descent of kingship. I have always found it strange that the more carefully you read these texts, the less random Earth begins to feel. Not because every answer becomes clear, far from it, but because the old myths repeat the same valuations with such consistency that you begin to feel a deeper memory pressing through them. This world is treated as precious because it can host a certain kind of order. That is what the Abzu means. That is what Mars lacks in their sacred imagination. That is what makes the middle world worth the trouble of preparation. There is one more feeling in all this that I do not want to lose before we cross into the final movement. The Abzu does not only make Earth useful, it makes Earth intimate. A world fed from below feels different from a world lit only from above. Fresh water rising through hidden channels suggests inwardness, secrecy, reserve, the sense that life is supported by something patient and concealed. I think that is why Eridu feels so old in the imagination. It is not merely near water. It is near the thought that water is already waiting under the land, as though the planet itself had been prepared to answer thirst. Once you feel that, the contrast with Nergal and the red dryness associated with Mars becomes more than symbolic. It becomes emotional. One world nourishes, another consumes. One world hides sweet depth, another glows with warning. The Sumerians may not have built telescopes, but they did build a meaningful cosmos. And in that cosmos, Earth keeps receiving the language of hidden readiness. The source now stands at the edge of its final widening. We have moved from tablets to land, from land to decipherment, from decipherment to kingship, from kingship to labor, from labor to survey, and now to the contrast between fertile Earth and the harsher cosmic zones around it. The next movement gathers the remaining great texts, Enuma Elish, Dilmun, Inanna's descent, and the flood traditions, and asks whether all of them, in different voices, are still circling the same quiet thought. This world was not merely there. It was ordered for life. It was occupied conditionally. And the clay has been trying to tell us that from the beginning. By now, the question has grown quieter and larger at the same time. We have moved through museum drawers and alluvial plains, through lost languages and impossible kings, through canal labor, Enki's surveying gaze, the red omen of Mars, and the hidden generosity of the Abzu. The source now gathers the last pieces of its argument, and I think it does so with exactly the right tone. Not by trying to force one final triumph, not by pretending the tablets say more than they do, but by letting the remaining texts add their weight until the listener is left with a pattern too consistent to dismiss easily. The first of those final texts is Enuma Elish. I have always thought Enuma Elish is most interesting when read not only as political theology for Babylon, which of course it is, but also as a world-ordering text. The universe in it is not called into being from empty nothing. It is shaped from pre-existing material after conflict. Waters divided. Heaven established. Earth fixed. Celestial stations assigned. Time itself organized through the setting of luminaries and the ordered movements of the sky. The source is right to bring it in here, because once again, the cosmic mood is not accident. It is arrangement. Imagine the first stillness after conflict in that poem. The body of Tiamat no longer raging, but repurposed. One part stretched into heaven, another made into the frame of the earth. Stations set, boundaries established. I have always found that image both violent and calming. Violent because the world is born from rupture. Calming because the result is order. For the Sumerian and Babylonian imagination alike, a habitable world is not the default state of reality. It must be imposed, maintained, made stable enough for life to happen inside it. That point matters for our question. If the world must be ordered to become livable, then livability itself becomes precious. It becomes something recognized and defended, not merely assumed. The source handles this gently but firmly. Earth in these texts is not just made, it is made fit. Then comes Dilmun. Honestly, I have always loved Dilmun because it feels like a place suspended between dream and memory. Bright, pure, clean, not yet ordinary. In some traditions, it is a kind of radiant, unsullied land where sickness and death do not yet have their later weight. Yet the source wisely reminds us of something crucial. Dilmun in its earliest state is pure, yes, but also not fully activated. It lacks the full gift of fresh water until Enki intervenes. Springs must rise. Sweet water must break through. The land must be watered into true life. That detail is, to my mind, one of the strongest hidden threads in the whole archive. Purity is not enough. Brightness is not enough. Sacred stillness is not enough. Water is needed. I think that is exactly why the source places Dilmun late in the narrative, because by now we understand what water means in Mesopotamian thought. It is not decorative blessing. It is the thing that makes a place viable. Dilmun only becomes fully itself when the deep responds and water enters. In other words, even the most radiant land still requires the very quality that made Earth so valued all along. Picture Dilmun before the springs. White brightness, clean distance. A place almost too perfect to inhabit. Then imagine the moment fresh water begins to move there, darkening the soil, answering dryness, giving the place not only beauty but use. I have always thought that scene says more than 100 modern theories. A world may shine. A chosen world must also sustain. The source then draws in Inanna's descent. And I think this is a subtle but brilliant move. At first it may seem unrelated. What has the Queen of Heaven descending to the underworld to do with Earth being chosen? But the cosmological map matters here. Inanna passes downward from the inhabited middle realm into the domain below, a realm of dust, silence, enclosure, deprivation. By contrast, the living world of fields, rivers, temples, and cities occupies the middle. I have always found the Mesopotamian middle world striking because it is not glamorized. It is burdened, noisy, difficult, and yet it is still clearly preferable to the barren or deathly domains beyond it. That contrast deepens the whole argument. Earth is not special because it is easy. It is special because it is habitable. Between the heights and the depths, between remote, divine regions and the underworld below, this middle band of watered land is where life can be organized. That middle position is one of the great quiet truths of the corpus. The source hears it well. Earth is not merely home because we happen to be here. It is the only level in the cosmic arrangement where cities, writing, kingship, grain, marriage, law, and memory can coexist. And then the flood returns. I have always thought flood stories reveal more about a civilization than almost any other myths, because they show what that civilization fears losing all at once. In Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, the flood is not only weather. It is administrative reset, population judgment, the terrifying proof that occupation of the world is conditional. The source is wise to interpret the flood in that light. If Earth had been prepared for civilization, then civilization could also be interrupted when it became too loud, too crowded, too disruptive to the order that had made it possible in the first place. Picture the flood in Mesopotamian terms, not as a modern cinematic wall of water alone, but as the collapse of every system the earlier texts valued. Canal and field erased together. City and livestock leveled together. The line between managed abundance and unshaped water suddenly gone. I have always found that the deepest horror in these flood stories is administrative. If that word can be used for a nightmare, records vanish. Roles vanish. Streets vanish. Hierarchies vanish. Water takes back the ordered world. That only has force because the ordered world had been so carefully made before. You know that feeling when the destruction of a thing tells you how much planning had gone into it? Flood does that to civilization. And yet after flood, in text after text, order returns. Kingship descends again. Cities reappear. Humanity continues under revised terms. That, I think, is one of the most revealing features in the entire archive. Earth is too important a site to be abandoned permanently. It can be reset. It can be punished. It can be thinned. But it is not discarded. The project resumes. That alone tells you how central this world remains in the Mesopotamian imagination. The source then brings everything together through 3 interpretive frameworks. And I appreciate the restraint of that. First, the mythological framework. In this reading, the texts are sacred literature, expressing truths about kingship, order, labor, and human dependence on divine structure through symbolic story. Earth is chosen in the sense that all sacred geography is chosen. Because the stories teach a theological value structure. I think that is a strong reading, and no serious listener should dismiss it. Second, the philosophical framework. Here the texts become reflections on what makes a world livable. Water, order, measurement, balance between chaos and control. The descent of kingship, the labor of canal digging, the surveying of rivers, the sanctity of fresh water, all of it becomes a meditation on civilization itself. Earth is chosen not as a science fiction destination, but as the only domain where the right conditions converge. I have always found this reading deeply satisfying because it preserves the power of the texts without pretending they are crude technical manuals. Third, the historical archival framework. This is the most daring one, and the source wisely handles it with the most caution. Perhaps it suggests, behind the mythic language, there are very old memories of real civilizational beginnings, preserved in sacred form. Memories of settlement planning, memories of hydraulic management so foundational it felt divine, memories of receiving institutions, agriculture, and city structure as though they had come from beyond ordinary human improvisation. I do not think one can prove that framework cleanly, and the source does not pretend otherwise. But it is not foolish to notice how often myth grows around real experience and preserves its shape long after its literal details blur. I have always thought the strength of the source lies in refusing to choose too quickly among those frameworks. Instead, it lets them overlap, because in ancient literature, they often do. Myth can preserve philosophy. Philosophy can grow out of practical life. Practical memory can be lifted into sacred drama. The result is not confusion so much as depth. The Sumerian texts can be many things at once, and still point in one direction. Earth is the place where civilization happens because Earth, in their imagination, uniquely deserves the work of civilization. Now let the museum return one last time. Not dramatically, just the drawer, the clay, the quiet, a tablet no larger than a hand resting in acid-free support, while beyond the walls of the museum modern life goes on without noticing. I have always found it comforting that old questions can outlast empires. The tablet does not care whether we answer perfectly. It waits. That patience is part of its power. What has the source really shown us? Not that the Sumerians held a modern planetary science conference and voted against Mars. Not that every line on every broken fragment can be forced into one neat thesis. It has shown something quieter and, to me, more convincing. Again and again, across king lists, flood stories, labor epics, survey poems, cosmological maps, and sacred geographies, the same assumptions keep surfacing. Earth is water-rich. Earth is administrable. Earth is fit for cities. Earth is the domain where kingship can descend. Canals can be cut. Grain can grow. Temple can rise. And memory can be pressed into clay. That repetition is the answer, if there is one. I have always found it strange that modern people often need the ancient world to be either fully literal or fully decorative. But the Sumerians were subtler than that. They could speak mythically and still be preserving what mattered most: The old tablets may never tell us in plain modern prose why this planet and not another. Why this world and not a red barren one under Nergal's sign. Yet they tell us, with remarkable persistence, what kind of world is worth divine labor. A world with fresh water. A world with fields. A world whose middle ground can support not only life, but organized life. So perhaps the final question should remain a question. Not because nothing can be known, but because some questions become stronger when they are not shut too quickly. Why did the Sumerian tablets keep speaking as though Earth had been prepared? Why did the first cities arrive as assigned places? Why did kingship descend instead of arise? Why was fresh water sacred enough to define civilization? Why did flood reset the project without ending it? Why does the clay keep circling the same idea from different angles? That this world was made ready. I think that is the note the source most deserves to end on. Not certainty, not frenzy, just the quiet persistence of evidence. Clay tablets sleeping for millennia. Scholars waking them a little at a time. The old alluvial plain still carrying buried bricks under Iraqi's sun. The red planet still crossing our sky with its older associations. And here below, the same question still breathing in the dark. Why this world? If you were standing with me in that museum room again, I think the tablet would look slightly different now. Not larger, not brighter, just heavier. Heavier with the possibility that the first written civilization did not think of Earth as a random stage. It thought of Earth as rare ground, water, blessed ground, measured ground, assigned ground, a place where civilization did not simply happen, but was made possible. And because the tablet does not shout, we can leave it there in peace. In its drawer, in its pale silence, waiting for the next patient reader to lift it again into light and ask, as we have asked tonight, whether the oldest clay archive on Earth was trying, in the only language it had, to remember why Earth was chosen first. Good night,